Welcome to part 3 of my hybrid workflow. Here I'm going to work on actual paper, Bristol board, that has my wireframe drawing that I created from parts 1 and 2 printed directly on the artboard. When executing artwork in different ways, so if I'm doing stuff just in black ink and no gray wash, then I'll usually print my hybrid structure out in light blue, non-photo blue, and then ink traditionally right on top of it. Here, since I knew that I was going to be doing this in gray wash, here I printed the wireframe drawing in black and shades of gray. So the first tool I'm using is a sketch and wash pencil. You can just pick these up at Hobby Lobby. My wife found one for me one day. I never thought I'd use it, and then I gave it a shot and I ended up really liking it, so now we bought a whole bunch of them. I'm just going through and adding a first layer of where I want the shadow to be. So this is going to look and feel a lot like if you're just using regular old, pencil to add some regular pencil shading. But I'll be using a water brush to liquefy it in just a minute, which will give it more of a watercolor gray wash type look. Even when I was working on the wireframe structure drawing, I was thinking about where I was going to put my shadows at in here. But with using a pencil like this, a sketch and wash pencil, you can be a little bit experimental with it, because you can erase this very much like you could a normal pencil. After you liquefied it and it's dried, you can take about 5% out if you erase it real hard, but the easiest way to control it would be at this stage when it's still just pencil. And I would recommend the first time you use this or any new tool that you first try it out on some scrap paper or a piece of artwork that you just do like a real fast sketch, so that you're not ruining a piece of artwork with a brand new technique. I have the camera set up just on a tripod over my shoulder, and then I have some cut-ins where I was holding my iPhone and just taking video with it. Unfortunately, I didn't have like a cameraman to get in real tight right next to my hands or something, so there's not a whole lot of close-ups because I felt very uncoordinated whenever I was trying to hold the iPhone and draw at the same time. So here I switched to a water brush. It's like a medium-sized water brush. You see here out of the corner, I didn't even expect to get this in the video, but I'm testing the water flow just to make sure that the sponge at the front of the brush is loaded with water, because you want a fair amount of water in loaded in the front of the brush, or else it won't smear around the graphite enough. It won't give you enough of a fade from the graphite out onto the white paper. Here I'm cutting in for a close-up with my iPhone camera, just to kind of assess what it looked like at that moment. And this is basically what it feels like whenever you're using the water brush. The graphite just liquefies and you kind of smear it around. And as you see, once the tip of the brush gets loaded up with some graphite, you can even go into areas that, I had not done any sketch in, that I had not sketched in. So it's primarily used just to smear around the graphite, but you can also create a third value with just using whatever graphite has loaded up into the brush. And even if I was doing this over the top of a regular, fully traditional piece of artwork that I had done completely on paper, this would be very similar to how it would look and feel like in the cartoon block videos that I did, the Flash and the Batman. I got to this same stage. The only difference was that there was some additional sketch lines kind of floating around and stuff. It was a little bit rougher of a piece. This is going to look a little more finished because I've taken my time and I'm working on a much cleaner, I'm working from a much cleaner starting point. So I usually go in 3 or 4 phases with the wash, and then each time I have to wait for it to dry in between. I'll go through and add the first round of sketching and then washing, which will usually give me my medium values and a few of my lighter values. It's essentially there just to give me the middle of the road values. But occasionally you can see me making sure that my brush is loaded with water. I go through quite a bit of water, actually. I usually have to, over the course of a single page, if I'm doing a lot of gray wash, I usually end up filling up the brush, at least, I fill it up at the very beginning, and then I have to refill it at least once throughout the process. There I was chewing some gum, I think, off the right side of the screen. I think with this piece, because it was relatively simple and I used regular traditional gray wash on the background, I just filled it up at the very beginning and then used the entire brush so it was empty by the time I finished the piece. Here I'm switching to some traditional brushes. Winsor Newton Sable series. I believe that the one I'm using here is number 4, and I'm also using just regular gray wash. And what I mean by regular gray wash is just I get a little jar with water and add a couple of drops of India ink until it gets the approximate sort of weight or value that I'd like. This is probably like I don't know, it's going to be like a 40% value whenever it dries. And I showed a close-up of me testing the brush because I wanted to stress that it's important that you know what value you're going to be getting. So, it's good to keep a piece of scratch paper off to the side of your drawing surface. Just test this stuff. I'm working on a tilted drawing surface, so I'm going to have to occasionally dab the gray wash just so it doesn't start to run. And I suspect that it's probably not the wisest thing to use a really wet gray wash whenever you're on a tilted drawing surface, but it always seems to work out because, I either just blow on it and make sure that, it kind of dries or I use a paper towel, or I just turn the paper upside down so it starts to pull the other way. I don't know, I kind of like that sporadic feeling to it. After all these years of working digitally and feeling very controlled and stuff, I guess I'm kind of in just wanting things to feel a little more organic, with still using the digital advantages. And just now I use my finger, just whatever surface I've used. The side of the paper towel after it gets really loaded with ink or something, I've used that to smear stuff around. It's like a giant brush at that point. Use my fingers, of course. I use Q-tips for different textures. You can get an interesting dry brush effect using a Q-tip. I'm just dabbing around, creating. My original plan was to just make the whirlwind as light as I could around her. That way, she would be the main focus. Because as time goes on, you'll see how much darker she ends up being than those background values. And again, I'm just thinking of cotton whenever I'm doing this. I just wanted to make it look as, billowy, cottony sort of feel, especially the stuff, the wind effect that's around her legs. Hopefully you can't hear this in the background. There's some weird rattling or skirting sounds, and that's actually because I have my window open. It's a really nice day right now, and there's some leaves blowing around, so if you hear that, you have very good ears. Okay, here I'm going for more of a chisel tip brush, and ironically, this will demonstrate why you should always check your values on a piece of scratch paper or something before you start using it. I guess I had not cleaned out this brush before I started this, and so it was filled with regular black India ink. So at this point, when I was trying to use a much lighter value, and you see me kind of move it away from myself like, what? I was accidentally drawing with a much darker, or suddenly was using a brush with a much darker ink value in it, which was disappointing and not in my original plan, but then I just went with it. That's, kind of the pleasure of being organic like this. I just started trying to see what I could use this for. So I started using kind of a twirl effect with the brush to make it look a little more random and sporadic, a little more violent kind of, and started using it as an accent all around in the vortex wind power of the piece. And now I've switched back to the previous brush, the Winsor Newton brush, to kind of cope with the mistake that I had made. Originally I was just going to use that 40% value or whatever throughout the clouds, and here I've resigned myself to that. I'm going to have to go a little darker down there. It won't distract too much from Cyclone being the main focus, but it's not exactly what I planned. And to add some sort of random energy to the piece, some sporadic energy to the piece, I started to do some spatter effect, and this will test your bravery if you're using this without something to mask off vital areas such as faces, or if you have some tight technology work that you've already inked or something. So I would recommend that if you're not real used to using spatter, or you're not prepared to deal with some stray dots that get into areas you don't want it to go, that you should either carefully mask off the area that you don't want to be affected by the spatter, or I sometimes just use like 5 or 6 sticky notes, just like cover the faces and that sort of thing, just to make sure that I'm guaranteeing I'm not going to get anything there, but any place else I'm okay with. You might not be able to tell here, but I waited for about, 15 or 20 minutes or something for everything on the page to dry, or pretty much dry. And after you've been working with wet media for a while, you kind of get a feeling for what you can get away with. Sometimes you can still work on a page whenever it's still a little wet. You can tell the clamminess level just like by the flat side, the ridge part of your hand. Whenever you're drawing on it, the paper might still feel a little wet, but you can get away with it a little. It's just, you don't want to work on it when it's too wet. You'd rather it be too dry than too wet when you're working on something like this, because when you're adding that second layer of sketch over the old wash, if the paper is still really wet, it'll start to tear up the paper and won't be a good result. So here you can see I'm the second wave of sketch and wash basically equates to darker shadows. Since the brush I've been using is getting even more loaded with graphite, I can also add some smaller subtle values. And doing things in waves like this, like doing the medium values first and then coming in with shadows and some of the more subtle stuff, gives me a chance to let my eyes rest, and I can tell better what needs to be accentuated in the piece of art. And I usually do this step like whenever I'm working on Captain Atom or any other project. Like I did 5 pages in a Green Lantern Corps issue that were all gray wash. I would work on several pages at the same time in gray wash. That way one page could be drying while I was working on the next couple. And it also gives your eyes yet another chance to rest, because as you're working on page 3, you're worried about those dynamics, and you come back to page 1, and with fresher eyes, there might be some stuff on page 1 that suddenly stand out to you that you need to fix or alter or accentuate. So I'm just fleshing out those areas, but going for medium to darker values. It'll start to bring the piece essentially more into focus, I guess. So I'm working from light to dark, as far as in the process, adding light values and then continuing to enhance where I want the darker values to be, over and over. I'll go over it about 3 times, 4 times if you count the pencil, the normal graphite pencil at the end. You'll just get a feel for it as you work with the brush. It's important to use the water brush on more forgiving areas of the figure to get a feel for it. I'm much more conscious whenever working on faces or hands of how much graphite is loaded on the tip of the water brush than the rest of this figure. Here I'm just kind of playing fast and loose with exactly how much of a gray value I'm adding in the shadows. And I'm making the effort to basically give an abstract shape for the feet, because the feet are not the focus, so I want those to be, it's as if they're moving kind of quick, or they're out of focus if you're using, a camera lens or something. Her face and upper body and the foreground energy blast are all in focus, and then the rest get more and more out of focus as you move away from those. Whenever I was working on her face, I was taking my time, making sure I had tested on the side, I tested the amount of gray, basically, that I was going to get from the brush on the side of her ear and the side of her hair, and then I knew what sort of value there was in the brush. In other words, I didn't just, go straight to the middle of her eyebrows and her nose with this really dark value or an unknown value, and then I could be, unpleasantly surprised by it or something. And every once in a while, the water is essentially, the tip is starting to get a little dry. That I squeeze the handle kind of hard to load up the front sponge with liquid. Here I'm switching finally to some actual, black values using archive-safe markers, felt tip pens. This is a Prismacolor size 3 felt tip marker. I believe that I let some time pass to make sure that the paper was dry. If you go in with a brush or a pen whenever the paper is still wet, you'll sometimes get bleeding, and you don't want that because then you have to clean it up. So I think I let some time go by to make sure that the paper was a little dry. When working in ink alone and just black values, you usually have like a fluid line going all around the figure. And here I just wanted some dark values and certain shadows, certain nooks and crannies, as opposed to having a fluid contour line around the whole figure. Here I've switched pins to Uniball V5 pin. It's more like a rollerball pin. It's got a metal tip to it. You can press a little hard. I like this for, you can get a bit of a quill feel to it, and I'm a little heavy-handed, and this responds pretty well to, you can press kind of hard on it without it bending and without ruining the tip as compared to, felt tip pins and stuff. And I like it for detail work. It's not the thinnest pin that I use, but it is it's a good size for most detail work. And it has an archive-safe ink that is pretty compatible color-wise to regular India ink. If I was a little bit better with a brush, I would probably do these lines with a brush. I'm making a brush look, in other words, with this pen. I'm creating thicks and thins that are intended to look really smooth, like maybe a size 2 brush would do. When it comes to inking in this tight of areas, I feel much more comfortable inking with this type of pen. Because I've been inking with this type of pen for the last 15 years or so. Even back when I was, in high school, I was inking with this type of pen. It's kind of what I started inking with, so pretty familiar with it. Even when I was doing the Batman and the Flash pieces Evan had recorded at the San Diego Con, I try to reserve, laying in spot blacks or shadow areas that are all the way black until after I've done the gray wash. And part of that is because I don't want to smear those areas, of rich black with the wash, and it's also so that I can, after I've laid in the gray wash values, I can see, what areas are deserving of the pure black shadow values. So usually the, laying in spot blacks is a process I reserve towards the end of the process. Even if I've mapped out where they're going to go mentally, or even have laid in some X's for where they're going to go, I usually still wait to execute it until after I've laid down most of the gray wash. I wish that I had some more close-ups that I could cut to through this work in progress, but this was the first time I did this, so just using the tripod was basically all I had. And it felt awkward holding my iPhone to get close-ups while I was rendering and stuff with my other hand. I'm very controlled with the smoothness of the lines when I take my time, and that's another benefit of using good paper and pens that don't bleed much. This sort of rollerball pen, like if you pause on the paper, it will expand the size of the ink line a little bit, but it won't bleed as much as, say, a Sharpie marker or something. That is, will bleed quite a bit into the page. So pens like this, or microns, or the Prismacolor markers will just give a little bit more of a control than like a Sharpie marker, and they're archive safe, which is important, so that the ink isn't leaching into the paper over time. I have some originals from 10 or 12 years ago where I was using Sharpies. The Sharpie markers are so acidic that they continue to leach into the paper for years, and they turn yellowish brown, and even some of the small lines I was using faded so much into the paper that it's hard to see the lines, meaning they started to disappear. So even though I have photocopies, that's good, but I don't recommend Sharpies for much finished work. Here I'm switching to another Prismacolor type micron pen, which is a size 8. It's a little bit thicker. I'm going to use it to outline Cyclone's foreground hand, her left hand, to create that foreground plane, so that there's a certain, basically the outline around her hand will set it towards the foreground. Then there's like a contour line around her body that's a little thinner and broken up, and then her back, her right hand will have very little contour line around it, which creates 3 levels of foreground, middle ground, and background, kind of depth. This thicker pen's a little easier to get a larger spot black values without having to do as much hand work with the thinner pens. Pulling long, smooth lines, just something that you get used to. I get lots of emails of people asking me, both working traditionally or digitally, how do you make, your lines so smooth? And it comes from years of practice or experience. Inkers like Scott Williams or something put me to shame. I mean, I'm just passable when it comes to inks. Scott Williams is a true master. I'm in awe of his stuff whenever I've seen originals where he's inked over, Jim Lee or something. His gradations are fantastic, and his control of a quill and brush are unmatched in my opinion. Here I've switched to just a regular mechanical pencil. This is like a size 9 or something, so it is a little thicker than a normal mechanical pencil, and I am creating final finessed gray tones, usually deeper shadows, that still look compatible with the gray wash. They will look a little shinier if you're looking at the piece of art at a certain angle, but it's a little easier to control where you're going to have these slightly subtle finessed shadows, as opposed to using some gray wash or more ink and or sketch and wash pencils. And as you can see, the paper's starting to curl at the top and the bottom, but that's okay. And I'm making sure, any area that I am sketching in or using a pen in, that I'm using my left hand to hold down the paper so that the curve of the paper is not going to be a hindrance. Here I'm about to start adding some freckles to Cyclone's face, like reinforcing them with the pencil. The subtle shadows in the nose, and then I start adding some freckles, some bigger and smaller ones. And when I get to her opposite cheek, I end up making so many small dots that it almost looks like a straight line or something, and I'm like, oh, whoops. That's kind of hard to see at this distance, but so then I break out this eraser. It's one of the thin, plastic erasers that work pretty well.
Plastic erasers can get out most graphite unless you've pushed really hard with your pencil or something, and then if you're trying to erase over it, then it might smudge it a bit, but you only make really hard final lines if you're for sure that that's what you want.
And another trick, something to use your finger with is it can kind of give you a little bit of a wash feel or something, just to smudge some pencil. It's another way to kind of give a gray wash feel without having to break out your brush and stuff again. And there's something just kind of fun about creating artwork with just smearing stuff around on paper with your finger. And in areas that I did not want a black contour, here I'm using the pencil to give a slightly faded contour around the figure. In certain areas that I want a cast shadow, like here with where the skirt overlaps her hip, give a bit of a cast shadow. These are what would be, if it was in color, some red stripes on her stockings. But as we get down to the edge of her legs, I want it to be less defined, so I wouldn't dare put, a bunch of black contour lines in this area here. Instead, I'll just use, about an 80% value using the pencil. give some abstract details. So, you know, it still looks like it's a full shoe, but it just looks like it's a little out of focus or something. I think a lot of people, you know, can be enamored with the render stage of a piece. You know, it's kind of got its, you know, it feels a little, it kind of steals the spotlight, I guess. You know, people might focus on the sort of polish, you know, that ends up completing a piece, all the rendering that goes into the piece, and it does take up the most time, you know, the number of hours or something. But, you know, I think it's more important to focus on getting your structure lines really complete, or getting them down pat, and then the rendering kind of comes afterwards to draw your eye in the right spot or something. Oh, and here I'm adding the only color in the piece, which is just adding some, you know, bright green eyes, which Cyclone has really bright green eyes in the comic. Little color accents like that can add a nice little touch to the piece. Here I'm adding some last little finesses to her face, adding some little shadows and contour to the side of her cheek and to her eyelashes. As the last piece of, or the last step in any piece, it's time for whiteout. This is a Presto correction pen. You can get them. You used to be able to get them at Walmart or, you know, any sort of office supply place, but maybe the places around me have stopped carrying them. I'm not sure, but now we order them online by the case, just so we have, you know, it takes us, you know, a year to get through a case or something, but just that way I'm not running out of it. And the whiteout has a bit of a bluish tint to it, so here I'm actually using it as an effect by itself. It'll stand out from the page. It's one of the reasons that I went so heavy with the gray in the foreground, is to lay a foundation for this, for the whiteout to really pop out. I'm emulating a lot of the same sort of lines, the puffy sort of render lines to create, you know, that I use to make the clouds in the background and stuff, so it stands out that it's like the most, you know, voracious wind or something. And this is a trick that I picked up from Jim Lee. It's where it's a way to make ink spatter without breaking out a toothbrush or something. It's a bit hard to see here, but you'll eventually, I think I zoom in a bit. But you just get a piece of cardstock or any, you know, cardboard or something, and you be a little conservative, especially at first, so you get a feel for it. But you just load up the corner of the cardstock with some whiteout, and then you know, use your finger to flick the whiteout onto the paper. It gives a nice little spray. I caution you, you know, here I'm doing this dangerously close to both of their faces. If I was, you know, if I wasn't so comfortable with using this method, I would have, you know, got some sticky notes and covered their faces, or some little scratch paper or something and covered their faces, just to make sure that I didn't accidentally destroy all the work I had just created by accidentally flicking a bunch of whiteout all over it. And here I'm, you know, kind of enhancing the random dots by adding some more controlled ones over the top of it. Here, this is how I sign my signature. I've taken to both printing my name and also signing it, because my cursive signature was just so sloppy. that I also had to print it, so it's a lot more work, but I just want people to know who drew it. And here is the end result, close-up. Whenever I scan this piece, I held down the scanner actually. Anytime I'm scanning something that kind of has warped paper, it's I put like a book or something on the top of it to make sure it lays real flat against the scanner. And that concludes the step-by-step process of creating this Cyclone piece. I hope I was able to shed some light on the process of using sketch and wash pencils, the water brush, gray wash, and pencil and ink, all in a traditional way to get a final cohesive piece of art. If you have additional questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Deadlines are always kind of hectic for me, but I do like to do this sort of thing, so let me know if you guys have any other suggestions. Thanks a lot.